The kitchen's rhythm. The sun had dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows that stretched across the polished wooden floors of Bennett's Brasserie. Inside the restaurant's gleaming kitchen, the sounds of clattering pots, the sizzling of oil, and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables created a symphony of controlled chaos. The scent of simmering sauces, freshly sliced herbs, and the occasional flare of a searing pan filled the air, intoxicating the senses of anyone lucky enough to be there. Jamal Bennett moved gracefully amidst the whirlwind, his every step precise yet fluid. He wasn't rushing, but there was a sense of urgency in the way he navigated through the kitchen, a dance he had perfected over the years. His mind worked faster than his hands could keep up, but his body had been trained to handle the pressure. The team around him responded instinctively to his quiet authority, each knowing their place, their task, and the importance of executing it perfectly. At the age of 38, Jamal had built more than just a successful restaurant. He had built a reputation, a brand, around his name. Bennett's Brasserie was a Michelin-starred haven, renowned for its fusion of Southern comfort food with French culinary techniques. The food was an extension of Jamal himself, deep, soulful, and layered with complexity. What many people didn't know, however, was that every plate that left his kitchen was a reflection of his journey, a journey that began far from the gleaming countertops of his restaurant. Jamal had been born in the heart of New Orleans, in a neighborhood where food wasn't just nourishment. It was culture, it was history, and it was love. His mother, a no-nonsense woman with a heart as big as her cooking pots, had taught him everything he knew about food. Food is like a story, baby, she would say, stirring a pot of gumbo. You need to season it right, make sure every ingredient has a place, and then let it simmer until it tells you what it's supposed to be. The lessons weren't just about cooking. They were about life, about resilience, creativity, and attention to detail. These were the principles Jamal carried with him when he left New Orleans to study culinary arts. It wasn't an easy road. He had worked in kitchens from coast to coast, bissing tables, washing dishes, and eventually learning how to be a line cook under some of the country's top chefs. Every job, no matter how menial, had shaped his skills, his palate, and his understanding of what it meant to work in the restaurant business. By the time he opened Bennett's Brasserie, Jamal had already earned his stripes. The Michelin-Star didn't come easily. It wasn't just a symbol of culinary excellence. It was a testament to his dedication, his persistence, and his refusal to let the challenges of life define him. Jamal had faced every obstacle with a quiet strength. Growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood, he often found himself doubted, dismissed, or underestimated. In kitchens across the country, as a young chef of color, he had faced racism, microaggressions, and the constant battle of proving himself worthy of a seat at the table. But Jamal never let it break him. Instead, he used it as fuel, turning the adversity into a driving force that pushed him to work harder, to be better, and to reach for the stars. Tonight, like any other night, Jamal was in the zone. He could feel the energy in the kitchen, the pressure mounting as the clock ticked closer to the dinner rush. But he wasn't worried. He had been through this thousands of times before. He surveyed the kitchen, his kitchen, like a conductor preparing for the orchestra to play. The team was in perfect harmony. Linda, his sous chef, was working on the risotto with her usual meticulous care. Marcus, the prep chef, was laying out plates for the appetizers, and Ravi, the pastry chef, was making sure the soufflés didn't fall. Jamal was proud of his team. They had been through thick and thin together, and they understood his vision. It wasn't just about cooking food. It was about crafting an experience for the guests, one that lingered long after the plates were cleared away. The kitchen was his sanctuary, and everyone in it respected the unspoken rule. No matter how chaotic the night got, they were all in it together. As the first orders began to come in, Jamal moved to the pass, where plates were being readied for service. He adjusted the flame under a pot of sauce, watching the delicate dance of steam rise, carrying the rich aroma of reduced wine and fresh thyme. The heat from the stove reflected off the polished surfaces of the kitchen, warming his face as he concentrated on the dish before him. A glance to the window told him it was getting late. The golden hues of sunset were fading into the deep blues of evening, signaling the beginning of the night's busiest hours. "Table 5 is waiting for the lamb," Linda called from the stove, breaking Jamal from his thoughts. He nodded, already anticipating the timing. The lamb needed to rest for just a few minutes longer. "Give it 3 more minutes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And don't forget to add the rosemary butter before you send it out." As the minutes passed, Jamal could feel the rhythm of the night picking up pace. This was where the magic happened. The final moments before the plates were delivered. The last touch, the perfect execution. And just as he was about to give the final go-ahead for the lamb to go out, he heard a voice, sharp, cutting through the usual kitchen noise. "This is it," the voice said, dripping with sarcasm. "This is supposed to be fine dining." Jamal turned, his gaze moving to the small dining area just beyond the kitchen. There, a man sat at a table, an overly sleek suit hugging his frame. He had a certain air about him, the kind of person who seemed to think the world owed him something. His face was contorted in disdain as he looked at the plate in front of him, a delicate piece of roasted duck arranged perfectly, accompanied by a side of smooth mashed potatoes and sautéed greens. "Excuse me," Jamal said, stepping forward, the heat of the kitchen still clinging to him as he wiped his hands on his apron. The man didn't look up at first, his eyes scanning the plate with exaggerated judgment. This isn't even real food," he said with a sneer. "I can get better at any overpriced bistro in the city. You're charging Michelin prices for this. Ridiculous." Jamal stood there, his fingers clenching slightly around the counter's edge. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the sting of the insult, but he held his ground. This was not the time or place for confrontation. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let some entitled customer throw him off balance. "Is there a problem with the dish?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice measured. The man finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Jamal. "You?" he said, the disbelief evident in his voice. "What, you're the chef here?" Jamal nodded once. "Yes, I'm the chef, and I'm also the owner of this restaurant." The man's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. "Right," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Well, let's just say I've had better. Maybe you should stick to something simpler, like fried chicken or something." Jamal took a breath, the words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit, but he let them go. Instead of reacting, he simply nodded and walked back into the kitchen. There was no point in arguing with someone who refused to see the value in what he had created. He had learned long ago that the best way to prove himself was through his work, not his words. As the night wore on, Jamal moved through the kitchen with the same quiet determination. He let the mockery roll off him like water on stone. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted him, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. What mattered was the work, the food on the plate, the experience he crafted for his guests. That was his true power. And, as always, the night would pass, the plates would clear, and his kitchen would remain standing, just as it always had. A customer's mockery. The evening rush was in full swing when Jamal noticed the newcomer. A couple had taken a table near the front window, their laughter and chatter rising above the low hum of conversation in the bustling dining room. The woman, dressed in a sharp, elegant dress that screamed high-end fashion, seemed utterly out of place for a casual Tuesday dinner. The man, a tall figure in an expensive suit, looked like he belonged in an art gallery more than a restaurant kitchen. He was scanning the menu with an air of condescension, glancing up at the framed accolades on the walls as if they were mere decorations rather than proof of a hard-earned success. Jamal didn't mind the occasional critic. It came with the territory of running a Michelin-starred restaurant. But there was something about this particular couple that rubbed him the wrong way. The woman, after a cursory glance at the menu, called over the server in an almost dismissive tone, "We'll have the signature dish, the one with the soulful twist," she said, air quoting the words with a smirk. The waiter, a young man still learning the ropes, gave a nervous nod and went off to the kitchen. Jamal barely heard the exchange. His focus was on a pan he was about to deglaze with a splash of white wine, the steam rising with a rich, mouth-watering fragrance. But it wasn't long before the sharp tone of the man's voice pierced through the kitchen noise. "What is this? Some kind of gimmick?" The man's voice was loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. He was talking about the dish, Jamal's signature creation, a perfect fusion of crispy fried chicken and lobster tail, paired with a delicate bourbon cream sauce. It was an unconventional pairing, but Jamal had worked tirelessly to craft a dish that was both bold and refined, a nod to his southern roots and his French culinary training. Jamal didn't react right away. He knew better than to let a few harsh words get under his skin, especially from someone who didn't appreciate the complexities of fine dining. But then the man's voice rose higher, tinged with mockery. "I mean, really, who puts fried chicken with lobster? This is ridiculous. You think you can just throw anything together and call it fusion?" The man laughed derisively, turning to his companion. "Do they even know what they're doing in the kitchen here? Probably some local chef who got lucky." The woman laughed along with him, her eyes scanning the room like she was in some exclusive club, her words laced with the same disdain. "I've heard of street food, but this is just, well, beneath us, isn't it?" The words stung. It wasn't the criticism of the dish itself that hit hardest. It was the implication. The idea that a chef like Jamal, a black man who had worked tirelessly to earn his place in the world of fine dining, could somehow be dismissed as an unqualified pretender. But Jamal had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best response. The worst thing you could do when someone underestimated you was to give them the satisfaction of seeing you react. He kept his focus on the kitchen, ordering his sous chef, Lucas, to plate the next set of dishes as he carefully garnished a small portion of charred asparagus. His mind, however, raced. Every inch of the kitchen hummed with energy, but his thoughts went back to the years he'd spent carving out his place in a world that often didn't take him seriously. Jamal wasn't just cooking food. He was battling perceptions, challenging stereotypes, and defying expectations. Each dish he created told a story of where he came from. A young boy in the South who'd learned how to cook by watching his mother, a man who had faced countless doors slammed in his face but never gave up. As Jamal finished plating the last of the evening's orders, he couldn't help but glance toward the table where the man and woman sat, their food now in front of them. The woman took a bite of her lobster and chicken and immediately wrinkled her nose. She whispered something to her companion, and Jamal watched as the man leaned in to taste it for himself. A few moments passed in silence before the man set down his fork, visibly unimpressed. "This is honestly embarrassing," he muttered loud enough for Jamal to hear. "What's next? Shrimp and grits with truffle oil." His voice was biting, dripping with contempt. But Jamal remained composed. He wiped his hands on his apron and turned back to the stove, adjusting the flame beneath a simmering pot of beurre blanc. His heart pounded, but he knew he couldn't let the words of a single customer, no matter how dismissive or rude, derail him. The evening wore on. As Jamal moved from station to station, checking on sauces, adjusting seasonings, and instructing his staff, the couple's continued complaints grew louder. He could hear snippets of their conversation carried on the air, but he kept his head down and focused. Yet there was a part of him that burned with the desire to prove them wrong. What they didn't know, what no one in that room truly understood, was that Bennett's Brasserie was not just a restaurant. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice, years of perseverance, and above all, years of learning to fight not only for the dishes he created, but for the respect he deserved. The night carried on, and the couple's mockery continued to fester in the air. Jamal knew it would soon reach a boiling point. But what they didn't know was that Jamal had an ace up his sleeve. It wasn't the way he cooked that would prove his worth. It was who he was, and the story he had yet to tell. a bitter bite. The kitchen buzzed with energy as Jamal directed his team, his attention divided between overseeing the preparation of delicate dishes and keeping an eye on the clock. It was an hour into the dinner rush, and he had learned long ago that patience, not speed, was the key to a great meal. Each plate that left his kitchen was a reflection of his passion, his artistry, and his unwavering belief that food could tell a story. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the couple's conversation drifted, the woman's laughter cutting through the ambient noise like an ill-timed interruption. Her voice, sharp and unbothered by the hum of the restaurant, made Jamal's skin prickle with irritation. The signature dish, a delicate pan-seared black cod, glazed with miso and served atop a bed of roasted root vegetables, finished with a rich beurre blanc sauce, was an homage to the flavors Jamal had grown up with. It was simple but layered with depth. Every element of the dish was designed to highlight the fish's natural sweetness, complemented by the tang of miso and the earthy undertones of the roasted vegetables. The beurre blanc tied it all together with a silky finish. Jamal's sous chef, Thomas, carefully plated the dish, his hand steady as he placed each piece of food with the kind of precision Jamal demanded. The sauce was the final touch, drizzled over the cod with just the right amount of elegance. As the plate made its way to the front, Jamal's gaze followed it. But as he glanced toward the dining room, he saw the couple's reactions, their faces unreadable as the food was placed in front of them. The man, who had been silent for most of the evening, took the first bite with an almost clinical detachment. His expression barely shifted as he chewed, his eyes flicking momentarily to the other diners, clearly comparing the food to something more exotic or refined. The woman followed suit, her lips curling in disdain as she placed her fork down on the edge of the plate. She looked up at the waiter with a thin smile that lacked warmth. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with fox sweetness. "I think there's been a mistake. This dish, what is it? It's a bit uninspired, don't you think?" The waiter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the remark, but tried to maintain professionalism. "I assure you, ma'am, it's our signature dish, Chef Jamal Bennett's black cod with miso glaze, served with roasted root vegetables and beurre blanc." The woman's gaze flicked around the room, landing on the small placard at the front of the restaurant with the Michelin-Star logo emblazoned on it. She raised an eyebrow, as though she'd just had a revelation. "Michelin-Star," she mused aloud, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Well, it's a shame that the food doesn't quite live up to the reputation. Honestly, this tastes like something a home cook might make if they had a good recipe, but not something worthy of all this." She waved a hand at the lavish decor of the restaurant, the ornate lighting, and the gleaming countertops. Jamal, in the kitchen, had been monitoring the situation. He saw the slight shake of the waiter's head, an attempt to diffuse the tension, before the woman's voice raised just enough for Jamal to hear through the thin walls. "It's like you're trying to compensate for something. There's no soul in this dish. It's all technique, no heart." Her words were a thinly veiled attack, meant to wound, meant to undermine the very essence of what Jamal had spent his life perfecting. The insult stung deeper than she could have realized. Jamal had grown up in a world where everything he did was questioned, where his presence in kitchens run by men and women who didn't look like him was constantly scrutinized. He had spent his life trying to prove that his culinary artistry wasn't just good for a black chef, but was, in fact, world-class. The thought that someone could so casually dismiss years of work and dedication made something inside him tighten. It wasn't the first time he had faced such criticisms, but this woman's words felt like they had been delivered with intent, her desire to put him in his place evident in every syllable. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. His kitchen was a sanctuary, a space where he could create and perfect. He wouldn't let a casual dismissal from someone who didn't understand the value of his craft ruin that. Yet, as the moments passed, the words of the woman echoed in his mind. Technique, no heart. A home cook might make this. His hands, as steady as ever, continued to work, But the growing seed of doubt that had been planted by her mocking tone threatened to sour his mood. He looked over at Thomas, who was plating another dish, and forced himself to refocus. "Stay in control," he told himself. "Do what you do best. Lead." Still, as the night went on, and the woman's laughter echoed from the dining room, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a passing comment. It was a challenge. And though he tried to bury it deep down, he knew that in a world where he had already fought so hard for respect, every slight, no matter how small, cut just a little deeper than it should. The moment of mockery. The plates were brought to the couple's table with all the fanfare that came with a dish like Bennett's black cod, and for a brief moment, the hum of the restaurant's kitchen seemed to fade. Jamal didn't often linger on the dining room floor, preferring to stay within the comforting chaos of his kitchen. But tonight, something felt different. He watched from the pass as the waiter set the plates down in front of the couple. The man's expression shifted the moment the dish was placed in front of him. His eyes narrowed, the trace of a smile fading as he studied the plate. Jamal's stomach tightened, instinctively aware that this man's thoughts were not kind. Jamal had dealt with food critics, wealthy foodies, and the occasional celebrity, but there was something about this man's dismissive gaze that made him uneasy. "What is this supposed to be?" the man asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He lifted his fork and poked at the cod, as if it were some strange specimen under a microscope. His face twisted in a faint grimace. This is fish," he muttered, as though he couldn't believe such a simple dish could come from a Michelin-Star restaurant. Jamal felt the sharp sting of the remark, but he kept his composure, knowing full well that people often acted this way when they were uncomfortable, insecure, or simply ignorant. The woman laughed lightly, flicking a glance at the dish as if inspecting an antique, completely uninterested in the nuance or artistry behind the food. "It's so basic," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "I was expecting something more exotic, more exciting." The waiter, uncomfortable with the feedback, fidgeted nervously, unsure of what to say. Jamal could see it happening from the kitchen, but he couldn't bring himself to intervene. He had been in the restaurant business long enough to know that you couldn't please everyone. But this felt personal. Jamal's jaw tightened. He didn't take insults about his food lightly. It wasn't just about the dish. It was about the years of experience, the countless hours spent refining each technique, each flavor, each presentation. It was about the countless sacrifices he'd made to get here, the early mornings and late nights, the failure and redemption, the deep passion he poured into every plate. As the couple continued to pick at their food, laughing and whispering behind raised glasses, Jamal stood motionless for a moment, staring at the service window. He could hear them now, their voices rising louder, carried to him like an unwanted whisper. "Do you know who owns this place?" the man said. His tone was dripping with entitlement. "This can't be good food. If they're serving this, they must have just gotten lucky." "I wouldn't say lucky," the woman replied, lifting a piece of the cod to her mouth. Her laugh was laced with cruel humor. "They'd probably been trying to get this kind of thing right for years." She took another bite. "And yet, it's still so bland." Jamal's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He wanted to storm out into the dining room, to give this man a piece of his mind. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he turned his back to the pass and refocused, his mind sharp with frustration. He had heard it all before. The ignorance, the presumption, the belief that food, especially food like his, could be judged so easily. He had worked too long, too hard, to let some entitled stranger dismiss his art. He understood, now more than ever, that it wasn't just about the food. It was about breaking the mold of expectation. It was about changing perceptions, challenging what people thought they knew about food, about chefs, and about the very nature of success. As the couple finished their meal with minimal conversation, Jamal's mind raced. He had been through worse, much worse, but this moment, this mockery, felt different. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know the blood, sweat, and tears that had gone into the restaurant they were sitting in, or the path he had walked to reach this point. They didn't know the sacrifices his mother had made for him, how her kitchen had shaped his love for food. They didn't know the years he had spent working in other people's kitchens, building his skills, proving himself in a world that had long ignored people like him. And that was what made this sting the most. With a deep breath, Jamal turned back to his team. He couldn't afford to let it show. His restaurant needed him. His team needed him. He needed to finish this service. But inside, the fire was burning. "What is this supposed to be?" the man asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He lifted his fork and poked at the cod as if it were some foreign object, untouched by the reverence it deserved. His tone was sharp, almost sneering. "This looks like something I'd get at a low-tier seafood joint. Overhyped, underwhelming." The woman at the table giggled, her eyes gleaming with the kind of amusement only someone accustomed to privilege could afford. "I mean, it's just so basic, right? I've had better at a tourist trap in the Bahamas." She took a delicate bite of her meal, and her smile faltered. For a brief moment, it looked as if the reality of the flavors, the tender, flaky cod, the umami-rich miso glaze, might surprise her, but she quickly masked it with a forced grimace. "It's a little bland." Jamal's grip tightened around the edge of the countertop as he watched. He could hear their words, feel the sting of their dismissive remarks, but he forced himself to stay rooted in the moment. He knew better than to let his temper show. In his line of work, restraint was as important as technique, but the mockery, thinly veiled under layers of pretension, hit a nerve. His sous chef, Marco, glanced over at Jamal from across the kitchen, reading his mood with quiet understanding. Marco had been with him for nearly 5 years and knew that Jamal's pride in his food was not something that could be easily shaken. But even Marco's raised eyebrows didn't go unnoticed. The moment lingered as the man continued to inspect the plate, his fork scraping across the fish with an exaggerated slowness. He then placed the utensil down with a deliberate clink and looked up at the waiter, his expression an unreadable mask. "I'll be honest," he said, his voice louder now, enough for nearby patrons to hear. "I don't get the hype. It's a shame, really. A Michelin-Star should mean better than this." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he held his composure. He could feel his pulse quicken, a familiar rush of adrenaline building up. It wasn't the first time someone had taken aim at his food, and it wouldn't be the last. The Michelin-Star, after all, was both a crown and a target. Yet, something about the way this man casually dismissed the culmination of Jamal's decades of hard work, the product of his very soul, was different. The waiter, visibly uncomfortable with the customer's critique, tried to smooth things over. "Sir, the dish is a favorite of many." But the man waved him off, cutting him short. "Save it. Just take it back. It's not worth my time." The woman, barely hiding her smirk, set her silverware down and took a sip of her wine, her gaze sweeping the restaurant with an air of superiority, as if everything around her should exist solely to cater to her whims. In the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans continued, but Jamal could feel a shift inside him. This was not just about a single dish. This was about respect. For the work he had put into this restaurant, for the history that had shaped his cooking, and for the identity that was so often overlooked in the food world. He had earned his place here, fought tooth and nail for every accolade, every compliment. He didn't need validation from anyone, especially not from someone who couldn't see beyond the surface. Without missing a beat, Jamal turned to Marco. "Marco, take the fish off the pass and start prepping the lamb. I'll be plating in 5 minutes." Marco gave a small nod, sensing that this was Jamal's way of putting it all behind him. As for the couple, Jamal knew they would never understand the depth of the dish they had mocked, nor the journey that had brought him to this moment. But Jamal wasn't cooking for them, or for anyone else who couldn't see beyond the surface. He cooked for the people who understood the value of patience, craftsmanship, and soul. The ones who could taste the years of practice in every bite, who knew that real quality wasn't just about prestige, but about the love you poured into something. Tonight, that love would show through in a different form. Jamal took a deep breath and pushed the irritation aside, focusing on the next step. His team followed suit, moving like clockwork, each person contributing to the bigger picture. But this wasn't just another dish. This was his message. As the new plates of food were prepared, Jamal stood tall behind the kitchen's pass, his hand steady as he meticulously plated the new dish. There was a calm that settled over him now, a calm that came from years of experience, from knowing exactly who he was and exactly what he had built. When the waiter returned to the couple's table with the freshly plated lamb, Jamal took one last glance at the front of the house before retreating into the kitchen. He wasn't angry anymore. He didn't need to be. The food and his craft would speak for themselves. A sudden realization. Jamal took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He turned back to the stove, the heat from the pans pushing out the sting of the criticism. But it lingered, that hollow feeling of being belittled, even if the insult wasn't overt. In the fast-paced world of a Michelin-Star kitchen, you could never let your emotions get in the way of the work. He had learned that lesson the hard way, years ago, in kitchens far less forgiving than his own. But as he heard the mocking laughter from the dining room, something stirred inside him, a quiet resolve. He'd been through worse, much worse, and his food, his creations, spoke for themselves. Meanwhile, the couple continued their dissection of the dish, their comments growing louder, more dismissive. Jamal's team, who had grown used to the occasional difficult customer, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Thomas, his sous chef, was clearly trying to maintain his composure, but even he couldn't hide the displeasure on his face. They were all in it together. The criticism felt like an attack on them all. Jamal could hear the man's voice again, slightly raised now, as he repeated his criticism of the dish. "This is what a Michelin-Star restaurant serves. I could make this at home, with half the ingredients. Just simple, bland fish." The words stung, not because Jamal cared about his reputation. He'd long ago stopped seeking validation from others, but because of the dishonesty in the man's words. The cod was as delicate as any ingredient could be, and the beurre blanc had taken precise timing and skill to perfect. The flavors balanced perfectly, a careful marriage of traditional Southern flavors with the sharpness of French techniques. Jamal's kitchen had spent hours perfecting every detail of the dish. This was the kind of food that, when done right, could make you close your eyes and remember the first time you tasted something truly great. But the mockery continued. Then, just as the weight of the insults was beginning to wear on him, something unexpected happened. The woman, who had been playing along with her companion's criticism, suddenly stopped mid-bite. She stared at the plate in front of her, her fork frozen in midair. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since they had arrived, there was no trace of arrogance in her expression. Jamal glanced over, but it wasn't until he saw her shift uncomfortably in her seat that he felt the first flicker of hope. The man continued to mock the food, unaware of the shift in his partner's demeanor. "Honestly, who even eats fish like this? It's like they're trying too hard to be fancy." He was interrupted by a sudden silence. The woman set her fork down slowly, carefully, as if she were afraid that if she moved too quickly, she might break the delicate spell of the moment. Her gaze fell to the cod, her face transforming from one of casual disdain to one of genuine contemplation. Her lips parted, as if searching for the right words, before she finally spoke. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. This is incredible. What did I just eat?" The change in her tone was almost imperceptible at first, but Jamal noticed it. The woman looked at the dish once more, her eyes shifting from skepticism to awe. Her fork dipped back into the cod, this time with a more careful reverence. She took another bite, her brows furrowing as the complexity of the flavors began to sink in. The man, who had been so sure of his own judgment, blinked, now realizing that something had shifted in the air. He looked down at the plate with a trace of uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, clearly still clinging to his earlier stance. "It's just fish, right?" She ignored him, her focus solely on the dish. "No, this is something else." She paused, chewing thoughtfully. "The miso, the beurre blancs, everything. The fish, it's so tender, but the skin has this perfect crispiness to it. And the sauce. It's light but full of flavor. Jamal Bennett didn't just make this, he crafted it." Her voice softened with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "This isn't just a plate of food. It's art." The man's expression faltered, but only for a moment. He looked around as if searching for someone to confirm or deny what his partner had just said. His arrogance was now replaced by confusion. "You're saying this is good?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. She nodded slowly, the genuine appreciation in her eyes now replacing her earlier disdain. "Yes, I'm saying it's amazing, and I think I was wrong about this whole place." The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, though Jamal had no time to savor it. His attention was drawn back to the stove, to the plates that were still awaiting his touch. But a part of him felt lighter now, his pulse steady as the adrenaline from the evening rush faded. From the kitchen door, he could see the couple again, but this time, their conversation had shifted. The man was now eating his cod, hesitating with every bite, clearly trying to reconcile his earlier critique with the reality of the flavors. The woman, however, was in no rush to finish. She savored every mouthful, her eyes alight with the quiet joy of someone who had discovered something new, something unexpected. The mockery had stopped, replaced by something else, something Jamal hadn't expected. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if the man would admit his mistake. But then again, Jamal didn't need validation from people like that. It was enough to know the truth for himself. He had spent years perfecting his craft, not for anyone else's approval, but because he loved what he did. Every dish was a testament to his heritage, to the lessons his mother had taught him, to the work he had put in over countless nights, hours of trial and error, and sacrifice. The mockery, the dismissive remarks, they didn't matter. What mattered was the food, and the food had spoken louder than any critic could. The woman looked up at the waiter who had brought the plates to the table. "Please, tell Chef Bennett," she said with newfound sincerity, "this is one of the best meals I've ever had. It's truly incredible." Jamal's heart swelled, though his face remained neutral. He didn't need to hear the words aloud, but it was a reminder of why he'd never stopped, why he'd never given in to the naysayers, the doubters or the mockers. In the end, it wasn't the praise that mattered. It was the undeniable truth that great food had the power to change people's perceptions. And for that moment, Jamal Bennett knew that his journey and his food had already won. Jamal could hear the man's voice again, slightly raised now, as he repeated his criticism of the dish. "This is what a Michelin-Star restaurant serves. I could make this at home, honestly. You just throw some fish on a plate and call it gourmet. Overrated." The words cut deeper than Jamal cared to admit, each syllable like a small blade carving into his pride. He had poured years of dedication into perfecting that dish, blending the bold flavors of his heritage with the finesse of classical French techniques. To have it dismissed so casually, so cruelly, was a gut punch he hadn't expected. He was used to critics. He had faced them before, but there was something about this man's arrogance that struck a raw nerve. Perhaps it was because, in some ways, Jamal recognized that man. He had seen people like him in every corner of the restaurant world, wealthy, entitled, and seemingly disconnected from the struggle, the passion, the artistry that went into each dish. Jamal turned his back to the kitchen, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders, like the heat of the stove now burning beneath him. He wanted to go out there, confront the man, tell him what he had overcome, what he had built, but he also knew better. No matter how much the customer was wrong, no matter how much Jamal's heart wanted to defend the work that he and his team had done, this wasn't the time for a public showdown. That wasn't the kind of man Jamal was. He had learned to rise above that, to let the food speak for itself. Instead, he took another breath and kept his eyes focused on the next task. Thomas, the lamb chops need a little more time on the grill. Make sure they have a nice sear. His voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. But the thought of what was happening out there, the mockery of his work, of his identity, gnawed at him. Back in the dining room, the couple's remarks didn't subside. The woman, sensing an opening, pressed on. "I don't understand what all the hype is about," she said loudly, clearly now wanting the entire restaurant to hear. "I mean, sure, the presentation is pretty, but it's just fish. How does this place even have a Michelin-Star?" Jamal's jaw tightened. For a fleeting moment, the impulse to walk out there, to silence them with words of truth, burned like a wildfire in his chest. But he swallowed it down. He'd always been about quiet dignity, not empty boasts. His actions, his cooking, his achievements, spoke louder than anything he could say in a moment of anger. The couple continued, unaware of the storm brewing just behind the kitchen doors. But then something unexpected happened. The waiter, visibly uncomfortable with the situation, leaned in slightly and spoke with a quiet authority that caught Jamal off guard. "Actually," the waiter said, his voice almost apologetic but firm, "I believe you're mistaken. That particular dish was created by the head chef, Jamal Bennett. He's the owner here, and this is his signature dish. The man you're speaking about is the reason this restaurant has earned the Michelin-Star." For a second, there was a heavy silence at the table. The woman blinked, her eyes widening slightly as she processed the waiter's words. The man, still holding his fork, looked like he had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. The smug expression slowly drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like realization. The kind of realization that comes when someone realizes they've crossed a line they can never uncross. I didn't know," the man stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. "I didn't mean." His words trailed off, as though the gravity of the moment was sinking in. The woman, too, was quiet now, her previously confident smile faltering. Jamal didn't need to look up to know that the dynamics at the table had shifted. He could feel it, the subtle energy of the room changing. But he still didn't leave the kitchen. Instead, he focused on plating the lamb, checking the herbs, keeping his composure. Back at the table, the woman seemed to recover her composure first. She began, but her voice was no longer as sharp as before. "I didn't realize. I'm sorry if I—" But before she could finish, the waiter interrupted again, this time with a hint of a smile that couldn't be entirely concealed. "You didn't know. That's understandable. But I think you'll find that the food here isn't just about the plating or the name. It's about the heart, the soul. Jamal Bennett doesn't just cook. He builds." The man nodded slowly, the smugness gone. He was no longer speaking with the same confidence, now unsure, perhaps even a little ashamed. "We will take the dessert menu," he said, his voice softer than it had been before. For Jamal, it was a small victory, but it wasn't enough to lift the weight of the situation from his shoulders. His food was more than just ingredients or techniques. It was a reflection of everything he had fought for. His childhood in a tough neighborhood, his long hours spent as a line cook, his tireless pursuit of excellence, and the countless people who had doubted him along the way. The customer's recognition of who he was felt like a hollow form of acknowledgement, a fleeting moment that wouldn't erase the sting of their earlier words. But in that moment, Jamal understood something deeply important. The way people saw him, whether as the chef or the Michelin-Star owner, wasn't the measure of his worth. The journey he had taken, the work he had put in, and the respect of his team and his community, that was what mattered. He had nothing to prove to anyone but himself. The evening continued, and Jamal went back to work, letting the rhythm of the kitchen ground him once again. He didn't need the approval of someone who didn't understand his craft. His dishes would speak for themselves, as they always had. The unveiling. Jamal's mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions as he stood at the pass, his back to the dining room. His fingers, once steady and precise, now trembled ever so slightly. Years of work, of blood, sweat, and countless hours refining his craft, had brought him here. Yet here he was, standing in the shadows of his own success, vulnerable to the sharp sting of arrogance from a stranger who hadn't even tasted the full story of his journey. For a long moment, Jamal stood frozen, staring down at the stove, the flickering flames casting an orange glow on his focused expression. The kitchen buzzed around him, his team continuing to push out plates with the same relentless precision. But Jamal couldn't shake the echo of the man's voice. Overrated. Just fish on a plate. The thought of confronting the man, to put him in his place with words laced in bitter truth, almost overwhelmed him. But then a voice, a quiet, steady voice inside him, reminded him of something more important. The food speaks for itself. Always. The decision came in an instant. "Thomas," Jamal called out, his voice calm and controlled, yet there was an underlying fire. "Switch me places. I'm going to handle the front for a bit. Keep the line moving." His sous chef raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him. He knew when Jamal made a decision, it was final. Jamal slid off his apron, wiped his hands, and stepped out of the kitchen. The familiar, intoxicating smells of freshly prepared food followed him like a cloud as he moved toward the dining area. He didn't stop to check his reflection or even adjust his chef's jacket. There was no need. This was no longer about proving himself in the kitchen. It was about proving something far deeper, something intangible. The dining room was full, the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses weaving into the warm ambience of the evening. The couple, still sitting near the front, had not noticed him approach. The woman was inspecting her phone, scrolling through some social media feed, while the man had turned back to his dish, poking at the cod again with the same smug, critical air. Jamal walked up to the table, his steps purposeful, but silent. The waiter, who had been hovering nearby, looked up in surprise, his eyes widening at the sight of the man who had remained a shadow in the kitchen all evening. Jamal wasn't the type to make a spectacle of himself. His presence in the dining room was rare. But something told him this moment needed to happen. He cleared his throat softly, and the man glanced up, blinking in surprise at the sight of the tall black chef standing at the table. "Is everything to your liking, sir?" Jamal asked, his voice smooth but tinged with something more. The man's face shifted slightly, but the arrogance never left. He looked Jamal over, then smirked. "Oh, it's you, the chef. I was just telling your waiter, your dishes, let's say, underwhelming. Maybe you should focus less on pretending you're doing something revolutionary and just make food that tastes good." His eyes flickered to Jamal's face, clearly expecting some sort of response, perhaps even hoping to see the chef fluster or defend his work. Jamal didn't react immediately. He stood there for a long moment, watching the man with an unreadable expression. The woman at the table, sensing the tension, finally put down her phone and looked up at Jamal. Her eyes met his, and there was something almost dismissive in the way she surveyed him, as though she were appraising a piece of artwork she didn't quite understand. Jamal's gaze shifted back to the man. "I understand you're not enjoying the dish," he said quietly. "But if you don't mind me asking, what makes you think you could do this at home? You say you could make it better. What would that look like?" The man blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I'm a chef myself, actually," he said, his smug smile returning. "I've spent time in kitchens around the world. It's just, it's not creative enough. You can't just throw ingredients together and hope for the best." Jamal nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He felt a flicker of something deep within, a mix of respect for the craft and disdain for the man's inability to see beyond his own narrow view of the world. "You know," Jamal said, his voice steady and calm, "I spent my life in kitchens, just like you. I worked my way up from nothing, spent years scrubbing floors, chopping vegetables, learning from chefs who saw me as little more than a body in the kitchen. I worked in kitchens where the heat didn't just come from the stove, but from the people around me. Kitchens where I was the only black person, and my ideas were dismissed before they were even heard. I had to fight for every opportunity." The man's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly regained his composure, clearly trying to mask his discomfort with a forced chuckle. "I'm sure you've worked hard," he said dismissively, "but you've got to understand, your food, it's just lacking. You're missing the edge, the innovation. It's a little too traditional." Jamal's lips curled into a small smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the kind of smile that comes from years of silent reflection, the understanding that some things can never be explained to those who refuse to listen. "Let me tell you something," Jamal said, his voice lowering, becoming more intimate. "The food you're tasting, the one you're dismissing so easily, it's not just a plate. It's the culmination of years of struggle, of resilience, of overcoming the odds to be here. That's the edge you're talking about, the soul, the history, the journey. It's not flashy or trendy, but it's real." The man opened his mouth, likely to retort, but Jamal cut him off with a gentle wave of his hand. "You don't know who I am," Jamal continued, his voice now steady, filled with quiet power. "But I don't need to prove myself to you. I don't need your validation. I've already earned it. This restaurant, this dish, it's a piece of my story. It's an invitation to anyone willing to sit down, to listen, and to appreciate what's put before them." The woman at the table fell silent, her gaze shifting from Jamal to the man, then back to Jamal. The man's face had turned slightly pale, his arrogant facade cracking under the weight of Jamal's calm but unyielding presence. Jamal took a step back, his job done. The man was no longer a critic. He was just another person in the long line of customers who would pass through Bennett's brasserie, unknowingly part of the chef's journey. Jamal had long since learned that not everyone deserved an explanation. Some people would never see beyond their own privilege and arrogance, and that was okay. With a nod, Jamal turned to leave, his footsteps light but purposeful. He didn't need to say anything else. The food, his art, his journey, spoke for itself. As he walked back toward the kitchen, he caught the eye of his team. Thomas gave him a quick, approving nod, his expression still one of respect. The line was steady, the plates flowing. Jamal returned to the heat of his kitchen, the place where he was truly at home. The hustle, the clatter, the sizzle, it all felt right again. Because at the end of the day, his food wasn't just about the flavors or the accolades. It was about who he was and where he'd come from. And no one, not even the most arrogant critic, could take that away from him. His sous chef, Thomas, blinked in surprise, his eyebrows knitting together. "You sure, chef?" he asked, glancing at the tickets still streaming in, the kitchen still in the thick of the dinner rush. But Jamal gave him a sharp nod, his eyes focused and unyielding. "Yeah, I'm sure. Keep the orders coming. I've got this." Without another word, Jamal stepped out from behind the pass and into the dining room. The hustle of the kitchen, the clattering of utensils, and the sharp orders over the comms faded into the background as he crossed the threshold into the cool, dimly lit dining area. His shoes clicked on the hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the hushed room. His senses sharpened as he moved, taking in the faces of the other guests. Relaxed, content, enjoying their meals. But his gaze was locked on the couple at the corner table. The man was taking another bite of the cod, his fork held almost disdainfully, like the fish was beneath him. The woman was scrolling through her phone, her attention scattered, likely already moving on to the next criticism in her mind. The two of them were the picture of privilege, completely unaware of the quiet storm brewing just a few feet away. Jamal approached their table slowly, his footsteps deliberate but unhurried. He wasn't sure what to expect. In moments like these, you could never predict how a person would react when faced with reality, when the mask they wore so effortlessly was about to be peeled back. He stopped at the edge of the table, his tall frame casting a shadow over their meal. The man looked up first, a small smirk playing at the edge of his lips. He clearly hadn't noticed Jamal at first, but now, as the realization dawned, the smirk faltered slightly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice already dripping with the thinly veiled sarcasm he'd used when criticizing the dish. Jamal held his gaze steady, not breaking eye contact. "Actually," he said, his voice calm but with a quiet power behind it, "I think I can help you." The woman looked up now, her eyes flickering from Jamal's face to the dish before her. There was a subtle shift in her posture, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but it was gone before it could fully register. "Help us?" she repeated, her tone skeptical, as if she couldn't possibly imagine what this chef might have to say to them. Jamal nodded, his expression unwavering. "You see that dish you're so critical of? It's my dish. I'm the one who created it, and I'm the one who owns this restaurant." The words landed with a weight that neither of them seemed prepared for. The man's smirk faltered further, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But the woman's reaction was more telling. She blinked, staring at Jamal, as if trying to place him, her gaze searching for some sort of confirmation. "Wait," she said slowly, her voice uncertain now. "You mean, this restaurant is yours?" Jamal nodded again, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Yes. I'm Jamal Bennett. I'm the chef-owner of Bennett's Brasserie. And yes, the dish you're eating, the black cod, is something I've spent years perfecting. Every single element on that plate was carefully crafted, every decision made with intention. But more than that, it represents something much bigger than just food." There was a long silence as the woman and the man exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting from condescension to something resembling confusion. The man cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable now, but still trying to hold on to some semblance of his previous arrogance. "Okay, so you're the chef," he said, as if still trying to wrap his mind around the reality. "But what makes this place so special? It's just a fish dish, isn't it?" Jamal took a deep breath, his voice steady, but with a quiet intensity now. "No, it's not just a fish dish. It's the culmination of everything I've been through to get here. I grew up in a small neighborhood where the odds were stacked against me. My mom raised me on the kind of food that was born from love and survival. She was the one who taught me that food isn't just about ingredients. It's about resilience. It's about using what you have, making the most of it, and never compromising on what matters. My journey from the kitchen of a small diner to running a Michelin-starred restaurant wasn't easy. It wasn't about luxury or prestige. It was about proving that my voice, my heritage, and my love for food had a place in this world." His voice softened as he continued. "That cod on your plate, it's a fusion of my roots. It's Southern comfort mixed with French technique, inspired by the flavors I grew up with. And every bite you take is a testament to my years of sacrifice, of learning from the best chefs in the world, of refining my craft over and over until it became second nature." The woman's mouth parted in surprise, her earlier dismissiveness replaced with something else, an uneasy respect, though she hadn't quite come to terms with it yet. She swallowed, her eyes darting to the man, then back to Jamal. I didn't know," she said, almost in a whisper. The man, on the other hand, still seemed to struggle with the idea. He leaned back in his chair, eyes now clouded with embarrassment. "I didn't realize. I'm sorry if I offended you." Jamal smiled, but it wasn't a smile born of anger or resentment. It was the kind of smile that came from understanding. "It's okay," he said, his tone genuine but firm. "Not everyone understands the journey it takes to get here. But that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Making people see beyond the surface, beyond the stereotypes, beyond the expectations. "What's on that plate?" "It's my story." The silence hung in the air for a moment longer, both guests now contemplating the weight of Jamal's words. Finally, the man nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "I'll admit, I was wrong. It's better than I thought it would be." Jamal's smile deepened. "You don't have to like it, but I hope you at least understand it." And with that, Jamal turned and walked away, back toward the kitchen. The evening had taken a turn he hadn't expected, but in the end, it had reaffirmed everything he believed in. About food, about resilience, and about how the true worth of something is often hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look deeper. As he re-entered the kitchen, he caught Thomas's eye and gave him a nod of approval. The kitchen, once a whirl of intensity, now felt like home again. Jamal's team, loyal and dedicated, was still hard at work, each member of the team adding their part to the symphony of dishes. Jamal knew this. No matter the critics, no matter the challenges, he was on the right path. And that, above all else, was worth more than any Michelin star.